Have you ever wanted to cut a juice groove in a cutting board? I have a cutting board here, and I did some research on figuring out how to do this. I've tried them with an edge guide on the router. I've tried them dropping the wood down on the router table, and I was never 100% successful in doing this. So I came up with a new way of doing it. So this is a brick pattern cutting board, and this Paduke with 1/8 inch strips of maple. And what I'm going to do is I cut some Baltic birch plywood, 3/4 inch thick. Because originally when I made this jig, I made it for a 3/4 inch thick cutting board. This cutting board happens to be 1.5 inches thick. So what I'm going to do is put a border around the cutting board to lift my template up. And I'm going to screw that in with some drywall screws. And this is just to lift this up, and it's going to help hold this in place. And I'm going to put this on each side of the cutting board, all 4 sides. Now I've created this. I took a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, I ripped it, allowing for the distance I wanted to be off of the edge of the router is where I set this fence. So what's going to happen is this is going to fit on here. And what's nice about this one is it's adjustable for any size cutting board. I think I can do up to 20 some inches wide with this one each way. And I made this so it overlaps that, so I can slide this one and adjust it for the thickness of my cutting board. I'm going to set this one on here, and I can adjust that, and then this last one slips underneath, and now I have an edge for the router base to write on all 4 sides of that, and then I'm going to screw that down. So now this lifted this up so that I can do 1.5 inch thick cutting board. And I think I'm coming in about 1 inch where the juice groove is going to be. I'm going to use a plunge router to do this. I'm pulling in tight on each side so the distance that I'm off of the edge with the router will be the same. Now I'm going to be using a Festool router, and the base that came with the router wasn't a perfectly round base. So what I did is I modified that. So this is clamped to the bench, it's screwed down there. What I did is I made my own base so that I have round. The one that came with it had flat spots for when you're using it with the Traxol guide. But with this, I'm going to be able to come in here, and I'm going to hit that round, and then I'm going to turn here, then pull this back, and then I can go all the way around with no interference there. The only disadvantage with this particular router is it has the vacuum hookup for it here. So that might change how I use the router in doing this, because where the vacuum hooks up, it almost hits my fence on each side of this. So I'm going to alter how I use the router in this case, because you'll see that if you can hook a router up to a vacuum, it's going to really help with all that dust that builds up when you're going around in the corners. So my challenge is, like I said earlier, was going to be with the hose. I'm using this new attachment that I got aftermarket, fits on there, that oval shape, but the vacuum hose is going to be rubbing on this. So I'm going to do this in phases when I run it so that I don't have this interfering. So we're going to start this. First thing, put safety glasses on. I'm going to hold the hose up here. And here we go. So I'm relocating the camera because when I turn this around, I don't want this interfering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin this around here. This is where the plunge router is nice, is now I can get the hose out of the way and I can finish this. Now I would recommend doing that in steps so that you're not spending too much time in the corner and leaving burn marks. This one didn't. This is a sharp bit and that worked out well. We've done this before without the vacuum and we had dust everywhere building up in the corners and it was hard to push it through and keep it lined up. The main thing is that when you do this, because I've seen where people don't do this properly and then they drift off to the side. You do have to have the fence on your left-hand side and push forward. The direction the router bit is going, you want to feed the router around clockwise. If you go the opposite direction, you try to pull this, if you drift off that fence, it's going to drift out into here. So I don't have any issues when I keep the fence on my left, and I have the router against that. I push it in, I plunge in, I keep it up against there, and I travel around there. Now this one you can see where it interfered, so that's why I did it in phases where I rotate this around because that hit. But changing this to the round base really helped. Having a plunge router that plunges in and then locks in place to get the depth you want is very useful. So this should help when you're making the juice groove on the cutting board.